Let's say we decided that it's not a keynote lecture, but to inspire us with a presentation.
Thank you for that introduction. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much, Barbara. Thanks, everyone, for inviting me to be a part of this workshop. And it's such a beautiful place. When I was writing this, looking through it this morning, I thought that it's actually particularly important for us to keep questioning, learning, and engaging with difficult questions, particularly from beautiful places such as this. So we need to continually, I think, remind ourselves of the systems and the structures and even the injustices that have contributed really to making some parts of our world so beautiful and also to making our lives as comfortable as they are. So I'm contributing today to a discussion that will unfold tomorrow about the relationship between the extractive industry and the post-colonial state. Now, there are lots of words in there that scare me. So let me start by perhaps disappointing you. I don't have any answers. So I stand here in front of you with lots of questions. And they continue to form as I think about these issues. So when Barbara first approached me in July, she'll tell you I was very hesitant when she said, can I come and speak and share some thoughts on these issues? I was honored, but I was very hesitant. So I've done some work on extractives under the guidance of Dick. I'm not sure if he's here, but he'll speak tomorrow, and Brian, and they're from an organization called AIDC in South Africa. And I've also done a lot of work on understanding the anti-competitive and strategic behavior of large firms in South Africa. And I just wanted to pause here and say to you that when I talk about anti-competitive and strategic behavior, we've had cases in South Africa where large firms have colluded to fix the prices of things like intravenous medication, bread, and maize meal. So the staples that people rely on and the things that affect their health. So at that very base level, it was kind of a shocking thing to have to deal with. But I've done that work, but I still said to Barbara, but I'm not an expert. I can't talk about these things. And the first thing she said to me was, I never had a man say that. so Barbara, that's a lesson, actually. I mean, in that moment, it's a lesson that I'll take with me. But I'm here, and I thought, on reflection, I actually said to myself that perhaps this is how one feels when you deal with the questions of power and justice, or injustice. These questions are so big, sometimes the motives are so unclear, just you can't understand them. And the consequences of getting things wrong perhaps feel so severe that I thought perhaps I shouldn't speak until I'm sure. But then I've realized that if I wait until I know enough, I'll never do anything. And that asking questions and engaging in debate with people who are asking similar questions is work. And it's the kind of work we need to do if we want to create the kind of world we want to live in. So I stand here with my questions, and I'll put them to you, and hopefully we'll engage in a kind of fruitful debate that will clarify or continue to form new questions in each of us. So let's talk about this big topic in terms of three questions. The first one is, what is extractivism? What do we mean when we say the extractive industry? And there's some kind of good questions around this, good answers around this question that we can go through quite quickly. But the second question is, but what are we really talking about? Because it isn't really about mining. What are we really asking? And then that becomes a little trickier. And then the final question that we're going to ask is, what is this relationship we're trying to explore? So what is the relationship between the state and the extractive industry? And why do we say it's complex? What are the questions that come up for us around that? So now that we have an order, I'll start with number 2, which of course makes perfect sense. Okay, so what are we talking about? I don't know, I mean, at first I thought, yes, we're here to talk about mining, we're here to talk about agribusiness, about big business. But it's not really, I mean, at its core, it's not really about that. What we're really wanting to understand is issues around growth, around development, and around progress. And we want to understand these issues in a world that's grossly unequal. And where, I mean, the estimates are that almost 1 billion people live on less than $1.25 a day, which is a horrendous measure, you know, of extreme poverty. I mean, $1.25, I don't know if it can even can't buy you a coffee in South Africa, for example. Much less, yeah, sure. And it's a world where unemployment, underemployment, poverty and inequality is on the rise. And just to illustrate this for you in terms of my context, which is in South Africa. In South Africa, we're talking about a world in which there's an unemployment rate of 36.4%. 36.4%. And it's higher among the young. And this figure, it includes people who've given up on trying to find work. So it includes discouraged work seekers. But even this is an underestimate. So just to give you a sense of what we consider as employed in South Africa, the only requirement is on the day that you are surveyed, you would have had to have done some work in the previous week for money. Some work. So this is the level at which it happens. So this is your life, for example. I thought about this visually, and then I thought, okay, let me illustrate this. So if these are the hours in a week, this is your life. In order for you to be classified as employed in terms of our surveys, that's the work you have to do. 1 hour of work. That's it. So at 36.4%, I mean, it's a gross underestimation of the access that people have to the economy. It's also a society in which 10% of the population earns 60 to 65% of income. 10% of the population earns 60 to 65% of all income. But then it gets worse. And the shocking thing is, a recent paper that looked at tax data in the kind of theme of Piketty. So they looked at tax data to see what the concentration of wealth is. And that very same 10% own 90 to 95% of wealth in South Africa. I mean, it's just staggering. So when you think about an income, a Gini coefficient of income of 0.7%, it shoots up to 0.95% for wealth. So really, when we do come together to ask these questions about the world we want to create, this is not it. Something is broken. Okay, so in this context, with this kind of heavy heart, it became clear to me that we want to understand how we got here. How did we get to this place when 10% of the population of 52 million can own 95% of the wealth? What is sustaining the state of affairs? And how do we change it? So the question is not really about mining or about extractivism. I think it's shorthand really for fairness, for equality, for equity, and for a way of being that is more sustainable and more humane. So now that we've kind of orientated ourselves, I feel like I've depressed all of you, but perhaps that's how you should feel right now. Now that we've done that, I want to return then to the first question about extractivism. So the simple explanation is that it's an economic model, and at its center, it's about the large-scale removal of natural resources for the purposes of exporting them, for example. So it's in shorthand really about resource-led growth. But that doesn't really tell you the whole story, so what I thought I'd do is kind of think about what it means visually. So when we think about these things, what could it look like? And this is really what it is. And I felt quite sad when I saw this. So the first picture is the big hole, literally a big hole in the ground in Kimberley, which is the result of diamond mining. So when diamonds were discovered in South Africa, it was in Kimberley, and we as a human race succeeded to excavate that hole and leave it in this way around Kimberley. The one on the right then is a coal mine in what used to be called Witbank in Malahleni, which is called Place of Coal. That's the name it's been given. And the one at the bottom that you can see is Johannesburg around one of the mine dumps that remain. So this is obviously a mine dump as a result of gold mining on the reef in the 1800s, but it's also being remined now because it's clever humans who kind of don't leave well enough alone, right? So there's still little pieces of gold in there that they're now remining, and you can see the city on the outskirts of it. But when you look at these pictures, it's pretty awful to think that this is the kind of economy that we're sustaining, this physical destruction that we're just living with. And the second part of extractivism is really around using resources to earn foreign currencies, or the exports that you can gain from that. So I thought, let me go back and look at what South African exports look like over some time. I went back to 1986, and these are pictures from the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which basically looks at the things that people export and then group them together in colors. I think it's quite apt that all the mining and kind of commodities they're quite dark. So all these kind of brown and greys you'll see are these are resources. So in 1986, as you can see, we're almost completely dependent on resource exports. It's not much better in 1996, which I chose because it's the year that South Africa implemented the GEAR economic strategy. And where we have made some, even if can I call it, where there has been some change, if I can call it that, in the light blue section, it's vehicles that are being transported and things associated with vehicles. So even there, it kind of feeds into a society that is highly consumerist and is spending its money on perhaps items that are essential. And this is where we are at the moment. So the color is slightly less comforting, the purple, but it's still primarily based on commodities. So it's gold, diamonds, platinum, coal, iron ore, and then other commodities. So this actually, if you wanted a picture of extractivism, it seems to me that South Africa does pretty well in giving you the kind of dictionary definition of this reliance on the extraction of commodities from the earth and the export and earning its currency, export currency from that. Okay, so then we have this definition of extractivism, but it has kind of changed over some time. It's been expanded and modified in some important ways. So it's not really just about the extraction of minerals and oil and gas, but we go further to think about the energy and water intensive forms of industrialization. So if we think about commercial agribusiness, for example, it's based on an extractivist, or what I would think is an extractivist approach to food production. So it's about the private ownership of land, then the very intensive use of that land, of water and energy applied to it, and then the sale of those goods, the food, for profit in the face of widespread hunger and poverty, very often of the people, well, also of the people who work that land. So it's about more than just taking things from the earth. It's about a mode of growth or development, strangely called development, that exploits natural resources for commercial gain, and it's about accumulation by dispossession, essentially. So thinking about various models of extractivism is also developed, and we'll touch a bit more on this in the conclusion when we talk about the state. But I do want to focus on two additions, I think, to our kind of thinking of extractivism that's emerged from the literature and from my thinking on this. The first one is about financialization, so the role of the financial sector in this story that well, it's not a story, it's our reality. The role of the financial sector. And the second one is about state involvement and the state ownership of these assets. So first, financialization. Now what is this? Okay, so it's it really is about the astonishing growth of financial markets, financial instruments, and people who play in the financial space in an economy. So gone are the days when you think of a financial institution and you think of a bank. For example, in Kenya, 90% of their transactions take place over mobile phones, financial transactions. So the telecoms operators in Kenya are financial actors. They give them loans, they give people loans, they sell them insurance, and even the revenue that's derived from retail, much of it comes from the credit they offer to low-income consumers. And I was sharing with Melanie earlier that I read somewhere that Walmart, for example, takes out insurance on its workers. So when a worker dies, there's a kind of financial benefit to the company. And of course, they justify that by saying they invest in the person, they train them, they have to replace them. But it's an income that accrues to a company based on the death of a worker. So it's this kind of pervasiveness of financial transactions and profit and modes of thinking that bring you more profit from money in non-financial sectors of the economy. So then how do we apply this to mining? Because I thought it would be interesting then to think about this in terms of coal mining. And we can just take a look at Glencore, which is a not so small firm just down the road from us here, to explore the relationship between financialization and mining. So Glencore is one of the largest physical commodity traders in the world, if not the largest. And until its listing in 2011 on the London Stock Exchange, people knew surprisingly little about it. In fact, in one article, it was referred to as the biggest company you've never heard of before its listing. And in 2015, Dick and I did an interview with a coal trader who worked in London. And he referred to Glencore and other commodity traders as the masters, the new masters of the universe. The new masters of the universe. So why did he say this? And he was saying this because traders like Glencore, who are also physical miners, are so large in terms of the access, the resources that they control, that they can effectively make their own market in some cases. So they have such market power that if they withhold the stocks of certain commodities that they have, they can manipulate prices in their favor. So they don't only extract commodities in the crudest kind of way, as we've seen at coal mine in Malakini, but they control the supply of the commodities, which gives them power over customers as well, which in some cases are nation states, and allows them to influence the prices for greater profit. And they're also present, so Glencore, for example, is present at all levels of the value chain in South Africa. So it's a miner, it processes in some, washes the coal, so it's limited processing, processes it, it sells it, and it also physically distributes the product. But what that means is that they actually have access and control over essential infrastructure in that value chain. So in South Africa, they have access to the railway sidings that feed a miner into the main railway grid, so the little connections. And they have a very large portion of control of the port, the export capacity. So miners are given almost like a quota, but it's just access to the port to export a certain amount of coal, and smaller miners have very little access. It's really concentrated in the hands of the large commodity traders. So what this means is that they can restrict, even in this coal space, for example, smaller miners, who are generally black-owned, from accessing the railway lines and from exporting their products through the ports, and force them essentially either to pay inflated prices, because they also get lower prices from the state-owned entity that actually owns the infrastructure. They can either force those miners to pay higher prices, or they can force them to sell to them, which is what happens in many cases. So even in this way where smaller and black-owned miners are trying, or the government is trying to establish smaller and black-owned miners, they don't have access to the infrastructure they need to actually be effective players in that space. And what it does also is, of course, it shifts profit from the small miner to the big miner. So that's the one thing that it does do, is it takes money away from those smaller firms to the bigger ones. And in addition, and Dick will talk a lot more about this tomorrow, these are complex and multinational firms. But it's very easy for them to also shift money around from place to place. And in the case of Rodman, we've seen this, that if you look at the sales and marketing fees they pay to themselves internally, it's very clear that they can be very successful in revenue terms but have no profit to declare in a country where the tax regime is unfavorable. So this is the other kind of consequence of financialization in these times of multinationals, of the kind of normalization of base erosion and profit shifting. So as financial markets grow, and as financial incentives in commodity markets grow, more profit is appropriated by financial centers, and fewer resources, even tax earnings, remain in the countries where the commodities are mined. So not only are we losing, in a sense, our resources, our land, our heritage, but there's no guarantee that as small a little contribution as tax will remain behind. And then, okay, so now we turn to the second issue, which is around state ownership and greater control of the revenues from extractivism. And yeah, I'm consciously using the term revenue, because at least if we're trying to have a discussion about a kind of social space which the state, I guess, should occupy, I don't want to use the term profit, because it implies that the costs have been taken into account. And of course, given the lasting environmental and social impact of these processes, it never is. So let's talk revenue. There's kind of talk about extractivism in a progressive way, or a new form of neo-extractivism. And sometimes the South American countries are kind of heralded as examples of this, which says that if the state can obtain a greater share of the revenues from extractivism, it can apply it then in the social good. So we can spend more. Essentially, we can have more social spending, and we can use that money to change the structure of the economy in a way that kind of benefits more people. Maybe this is a step forward. Maybe. But taking that analogy further, I think as we're taking that step forward, we're kind of kicking the ball down the road for future generations to deal with. Because fundamentally, the structure doesn't change, and we're just leaving this problem for future generations to deal with. Perhaps we're giving them more tools, but this is one of those questions that I can't come to, some kind of clarity on in my mind. I'm unclear, and I feel like this is something we should discuss. I don't know if there's a thing such as progressive extractivism, and is it an area in which we can take small steps? I don't know. So I'll leave that kind of in the room. And then on the final question, and this is about the relationship of the post-colonial state and the extractive industry. So at first I was very kind of proud about this. I thought I have two answers that I can talk about. I can talk about complacency of the state. Oh, that's not clear at all. And I can talk about complicity. Right? So I thought, okay, that's what we can talk about. And then, as I started thinking about it a bit more, I thought this is actually, it's not the correct kind of phrasing. It's not an either or. There's a very clear link between these two approaches, really, that the state can have. So first, let's talk about complacency. So if we think about a society in transition, perhaps it is true that you start with what you have. Perhaps you earn the foreign currency you need from the established extractive base that you've inherited. So in South Africa, what this means is you continue along a mining and energy-intensive path of industrialization. And then when you run out of energy, you just mine more coal and build more coal-fired power stations. So you work with what you have. So in this version, the state is kind of passive. And it's focused, it's not passive in the sense that it does nothing, but it's focused on other things. It's focused on transitional governance, it's focused on building institutions, it's focused on things like creating some kind of identity, kind of mediating between the public and private sector. So it's in the state of figuring out what it is who it is and what needs to happen. So it deals with extractivism at a later stage. And then it also might do this kind of progressive extractivism. It might take a little bit of money, spend it on social programs or on changing the structure of the industry and investing in more productive industries. All of this for the future, of course, whenever that comes. But then the big problem, I think, with framing this is that doing nothing, so being complacent, is a choice. And it's a political choice. And perhaps the implications of that aren't understood, I think, when that nothingness is being done. But it is a choice. So the more complete answer, I think, is complacency because the state is complicit in this extractivism. So what happened in South Africa, shall I say, is that the fortunes of the state became increasingly tied with extractivist industries. So if you don't deal with this initially, 22 years after our transition in 1994, which transition, whatever, to democracy, whatever that also means, the structure of the economy essentially is the same. Essentially, it's the same. It's highly concentrated, dominated by large firms who are doing well and growing. Again, back to our point about the wealth control, 10% of the population still owns 95% of the wealth. So the decision in our case in South Africa to do nothing, not to break these firms up, not to be activists in the sense that they create new players or do things differently or think differently about the kind of economic growth that they want, ties the fortunes of government with the base, the extractivist base. And even more so, when we think about the kind of economic empowerment route that was followed in South Africa, in practice, it was about saying to large firms, sell a stake of your business, or sell, not even give, sell a stake of your business, a part of your business, to black South Africans. Which means, and this eventually created a kind of a black elite, and a politically connected black elite. So the state is even more intertwined now with maintaining the status quo, because the benefits of it are kind of, it's the same people who benefit from it, right? So the existing economic structure, I mean, it's not a mistake. You can't say anymore that it's a mistake. And choosing to do nothing remains a political choice that's made, and means that the state remains complicit in supporting this extractivist base. So, I mean, in conclusion, I'm saying that once that hand's been played, once you decide to do nothing, you now leave yourself very little room to move. And the final question I then had is, then where to for now? Or from here, what do we do? And I think it's highly unlikely that we can look towards the state for solutions, really. And so I suppose my question to you is, and as we talk about this tomorrow, my question is, who do we look to? And at least we've got us in this room, so we can look to each other. But what are the steps that we can take then to get out of this quagmire?
Thank you, Tamara, very much for this wonderful introduction, opening talk. And we have over straight through Melanie, will engage with what you heard and will also
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tamara, for this excellent presentation. I think it gives us a lot of fruitful thought already for tonight and also for tomorrow. You mentioned so